What we're looking at here is a map of the Russian space. We have to start with the war. On the left, you've got a combined climate and economic map, and on the right, you have a population density map. So let's start on the right. The lighter color of orange that's going from roughly Central Europe down into Central Siberia, that is where everybody lives. Now, if you will notice on the left, it overlays with the green. That is the Russian wheat belt. That's where you grow everything. Now, this is not a particularly great place to be. And there's not a lot of people here. So that lighter color of orange, that's roughly the population density of Nebraska. The green zone, the wheat belt, is really, really crappy land. In fact, in terms of global agricultural basins, it's the least productive of them in the world. And it's because of the weather. In the summer, it's roughly the same as Western Kansas, so hot, dry. And in the winter, it's about the same as northeastern Alberta, so cold, dry, windy. You can grow one wheat crop, and you have to kind of race to get it into the ground after the last frost and race to get it before the first frost, because those two dates are only about 3.5 months apart. And the income that you get from that one wheat crop is so low per acre that Russia has never been able to build a road network. If you want to move anything within the Russian space at scale, you have to do it by rail. Now, on the map on the left, if you go to the right, to the north, to the blue, you are in tundra and Tagai. Completely empty. No one lives there. If you go to the left, to the yellow, to the south, you're in desert. No one lives there. But the real fun and games, and the reason why the Russians drink so much, is the beige on the shoulders. Territories that even by the Russian definition are completely economically useless, but you could still shove a panzer division through that because it's flat. Russia has been invaded 50-odd times in its history, and every time a foreigner has made it to the green, the Russians have never driven them back. The weather has. Because the Russians can't move in their own space, but any foe who managed to get there clearly can cross distances at speed. So the only way the Russians have ever discovered that they can survive in their own neighborhood is to expand out of the green through the beige until they reach a series of geographic barriers that you can't run a Mongol horde through. And then they forward position their very, very slow-moving troops in the footprints between those barriers. Plug the gaps. During the Soviet period, the Russians controlled every single one of those plugs. Post-Soviet Russia only controlled one. And everything that Vladimir Putin has done in foreign affairs since 1999 has been about repositioning that forward defensive perimeter. This is the Karabakh War, the Kazakh intervention, the Donbass War, the Crimea War, the Georgian War. He's about halfway done. The question has never been, will Russia stop before it has all of Ukraine? See, Russia and Ukraine doesn't control the gaps. Ukraine is on the way to the gaps. So the question has always been, how long will it take the Russians to reposition after they've conquered all of Ukraine and go to the next line of countries, which include Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Romania, and Poland? The scale of what the Russians are trying to do here, we have a hard time wrapping our mind around it. I mean, the United States is a big country, but the Russians have 3 times the borders and half the population. If they can't forward position, they die. It's very, very simple. This war was always going to happen. Okay, so that's the big strategic picture. Let's look at the tactical picture. The dotted lines on this map are those all-important rail connections. The deep red were the territories that the Russians controlled at the end of the last war in 2014. So anyone who says if you just give the Russians a little bit of land, they'll stop, no. This is the 7th time they've done this since 1999. So, and then the pink areas are the territories that the Russians occupied as of the 1st of September. Now, you guys remember back to the beginning of the war in the very first week when we saw that giant 40-mile-long convoy of military vehicles coming from Belarus south to Kiev. And then on the 4th day of the war, that convoy stopped because they forgot fuel trucks. And on the 7th day of the war, the soldiers got out of the equipment and walked back to Belarus because they also forgot food. Everyone I talked to at the Defense Department and every NATO defense ministry had the same general position. They're like, holy crap, the Russians do not know how to fight a war anymore. They have forgotten. They are doing worse than the Iraqis did in 1992 in Desert Storm. If NATO forces and Russian forces meet on the field of battle, they will be obliterated. It will be a 1,000-to-1 casualty ratio. We will destroy them as a conventional power in a matter of weeks. And this made no one happy, because for the Russians, this is a battle for their existential survival. They can't stop, they won't stop, which means nukes are on the table. And if we have a conventional fight, there will be a nuclear exchange. So the decision was made very, very early in the war that the Russian military had to be destroyed here, now, forever, but without a single NATO soldier, because then we would have the obliteration and the nukes would fly. So any weapon system that the Ukrainians can prove that they can competently operate, they can have. And to expand the list of things that they can competently operate, 60,000 Ukrainian troops are already training in NATO countries right now. 15,000 have already been deployed back to Ukraine. And with every month, the technological capacity for them to absorb weapons increases. That was our lesson. The Russians had their own. When it became apparent that the Ukrainians were fighting back, the Russian lesson was, well, crap, maybe we shouldn't have drank all of that Kool-Aid that we made. If the Ukrainians are not going to welcome us as liberators, then instead of being a non-issue, the civilians suddenly are a problem that we have to deal with. So we're going to dust off a strategy that we perfected well before World War I, that we've used in Chechnya and Syria. And we're going to advance very slowly under a hail of artillery, destroying not anything that moves, but instead anything that stands. Because if we can obliterate all civilian infrastructure, especially agricultural infrastructure, then this land becomes uninhabitable for a civilian population. And if we do that, the population will self-segregate. Most will run, they'll become refugees, and we never have to worry about them again. Anyone who stays, who is under age 55, clearly stayed to fight. And we can shoot them on sight. It's difficult to get good data on civilian casualties out of a war zone, but the best guess is over 250,000 civilians have been killed to this point, and at least 1 million have been kidnapped and shipped to Siberia, mostly children. The scale of the human devastation is on pace with the Holocaust, but that's the express goal, to eliminate the Ukrainians as a factor. Almost 4 months ago now. The Ukrainians started advertising that they were going to launch an assault here on what is known as the Kherson Pocket. It's the only chunk of territory west of the river that the Ukrainians lost to the Russians early in the war. The Russians saw the advertisements and started moving troops to that pocket, about 20,000 troops in total, in addition to what was already there, their best troops, their best equipment. Now, as we all know, that wasn't the only thing going on. The Ukrainians were watching to see where those troops were pulled from, and they launched a second offensive here in Kharkiv, and the Kharkiv front completely collapsed in 5 days. The best part of that is you'll notice, you see the city of Lyman, just below that there's a little dingleberry territory. That's the city of Izium. Izium was their forward deployment base, their forward logistical hub, where they had all of their tanks and all of their ammo and all of their artillery, and it fell in 36 hours intact. In 36 hours, the Ukrainians captured more gear from the Russians than NATO had transferred to them in 7 months. They captured more in 36 hours than they had started the war with. And territory changed. We're now in a bit of a holding pattern. It's been mud season until very recently. Can you imagine basically operating a tank in a farm field when it's saturated with fall weather? You don't move. So now that things are freezing solid, we're probably going to see a little bit of movement. And now it's kind of a war of logistics. What we've got here in the south, that's the Kerch Strait Bridge. You'll notice the dotted line. Kerch is the only rail connection between Russia proper and the southern front. And a few weeks ago, somebody blows it up, which means that anything that the Russians want to bring into the front now has to be moved by truck. Now, you guys remember those javelins from earlier in the war? For the most part, the Ukrainians were not targeting tanks or artillery. They were targeting military tactical support trucks, of which the Russians started the war with about 3,000. They're now down to under 800. So they've literally been going town by town in the Russian Federation and confiscating city buses and literally Scooby-Doo vans to move artillery shells around the front. I mean, when a Scooby-Doo van loaded down with artillery shells hits a bump, there's a show. But that's all the Russians have to work with right now. Remember, slow-moving forces must be rail supplied. The rail line is offline. This is their only option. So the next phase, what we're going to probably see in the next days to weeks, actually probably days, they probably started shaping operations yesterday, is this push down straight south. The Ukrainians would love to get all the way to the water. They would love to completely sever the Crimean Peninsula off from all support. But they don't need to. All they need to do is get close enough to some of these roads to interdict the Scooby-Doo trucks. That's not hard. And if you do that, you can make the Crimean Peninsula into a death trap. And that's ultimately how Ukraine might win this war. See, the thing about the Russians is they're so casualty inured that the Russians have never accepted terms or sought terms in any war in their history unless they've at first lost at least 500,000 men to combat. They fight until they can't. At the moment, the death toll for the Russians is probably between 80 and 90,000. We have a long way to go. But if you cut the rail connection and leave it cut, and you can interrupt the supplies, then there's only one thing left to do. This dotted blue line is the Crimea Canal. It is the sole water source for farmland on the Crimean Peninsula. And its sluice gate is in Kherson, and the Ukrainians now control it. Well, that's 80% of food production in Crimea that just went offline. Crops they're not going to be able to grow this coming year. If the Ukrainians are going to win this, they're going to trigger a 1980s Ethiopia-style famine in the Crimea, a population of 3 million, mostly ethnic Russians, and the current location of the bulk of Russia's deployable military forces. That's how Ukraine wins. This is and always will be about scale. So, that's the strategic, that's the tactical. Let's talk about the economic. You take everything in that first column, the belligerents involved, Russia, Belarus, Ukraine, are collectively the world's largest supplier, second largest for the second column, and so on. The folks at the CIA asked me to come present this one slide to them about a month ago. Yeah, 64 words, one slide, deep in the bowels of the agency. That was not intimidating at all. It's like they had all kinds of questions, but they wouldn't answer any of mine. Let me just talk about a few of these real quick. First of all, aluminum and titanium. The Russian system doesn't have any bauxite. So what they do is they import bauxite, they import alumina, the intermediate product that is eventually turned into the metal, and they bring it into the Russian system. Now, when the Russian industry collapsed at the end of the Cold War, all their power generation was left, but all their industry went away. So they had all this extra electricity. So they use that electricity to turn the raw materials into the finished metal, and then they export it. The problem for the Russians is most of the bauxite and aluminum, about 3/4 of the total, comes from Australia and Ireland, countries that have said, we're not going to trade with you anymore. So it's in the process of going down. The primary customer for Russian aluminum is Airbus. Then there's titanium. The ore that the Russians export isn't from Russia, it's from Ukraine. The ore is exported to Russia for processing with all that extra electricity, and then the titanium metal is exported. Their primary customer is Airbus. You guys have all heard about Brexit, right? God, what a shit show. Airbus is a consortium of aerospace companies from Spain, France, Germany, and Britain. They all make different parts of the plane. The Brits make the wings and the engine. The Brits are trying to get a free trade deal with the United States. And we've made it very clear, sure, that's great. You got to ditch Airbus. You got to join Boeing, which means that the future of European aviation is one without aluminum, titanium, wings, or engines. Russia is not just the world's largest exporter of wheat. Russia is not just deliberately destroying the physical agricultural infrastructure of the world's 5th largest exporter. This space is the single largest supplier of fertilizer as a category, as well as the world's single largest supplier of potash to the world. Already, those exports are down by about 1/3. And one of the fun things to keep in mind about Russian infrastructure is it is old. Most of the Russian industrial capacity for agriculture was built in the 60s under Khrushchev. And the only reason it still operates today is with a lot of Western tech, duct tape, and help. And that's all stopped. We are already seeing industrial accidents in the Russian energy and agricultural space that are so big in exploding capacity that we can see them from orbit. We should count on all of this going away. We'll come back to that. All right, let's talk energy. This is a pipeline map. The green are oil, the red are natural gas, and the places that matter are these two ports, Primorsk on the Baltic Sea in the north and Novorossiysk on the Black Sea in the south. And it's really all about insurance. You can tell who's from Des Moines, like, ooh, insurance. Look to the Des Moiners. Des Moiners, Des Moines, Des Moinians. I'm from Iowa. I should know this. Anyway, this gets really sexy really fast. So you cannot have your vessel enter a port or exit a port or go into a constrained waterway like, say, the Turkish Straits without an insurance policy. You have to have indemnification coverage. Well, one of the many aspects of the sanctions is that the Europeans, Japanese, and Americans, and that's over 95% of all policies, have said, no, we're not going to insure any Russian-flagged, chartered, or owned vessel. The way the Russians are getting around this: two-step process. Number one, they've formed their own insurance, kind of sloppy, but it's there. And they're covering ships, shuttle ships, because you can't get a super tanker into these ports, they're too shallow, to run cargo from these ports around Europe to off the coast of Portugal, where step two, the Chinese have rented a half a dozen super tankers, lashed them together into a super raft, and they're doing sea-to-sea transfers from the shuttle tankers to the raft to additional super tankers who will then do the long circumcontinental trip to the East Asian coast. Now, there are so many ways this can go horribly wrong. Sea-to-sea transfers are dangerous in port, in calm, protected waters, much less on the high seas. So the environmental risk here is not minor. And in addition, you'll notice that the routes out of these places go by a lot of countries that really don't think very highly of the Russians right now. And since the Russians are the ones doing the insuring, and there's a sanctions regime in place, if you're like, say, Lithuania, and you just wake up and go, you know what, I'm going to fuck with the Russians today. And they just go and they grab a ship, that's a $500 million to $1 billion payout. And at that point, no one else is going to want to run the route. So not only can you bankrupt the Kremlin, you can wreck their export route. That does a lot more than it sounds like, because these ports don't have storage capacity, very little. And so if ships stop taking crude away, pressure builds up in the pipes all the way back to the wellhead. And this isn't North Dakota. This is a place that's actually cold. It's permafrost. You guys are all Iowans, you get it. In the winter, as long as you're moving, you're fine. It's when you stop that you die. Same with crude. As it's flowing through that subsurface frozen layer, as long as it's moving, it's liquid. But if it stops moving for any reason, it consolidates into a gel plug, and the water that comes up as a byproduct of all oil production freezes into ice. And when water freezes, it expands, and it pops the pipe from the inside. Now, the last time this happened at scale, it was 1992. The damage was so horrific, it took the Russians 30 years to repair it. And it wasn't the Russians who did the repairs. It was the Western oil firms who are no longer there. We're looking at 4 million barrels per day of Siberian production, Western Siberian production, that is in some degree of danger. If that all goes offline, wow. Oil is not like soy. If you don't get soy, you have wheat or pork or whatever. There are substitutes. If you don't have oil, things stop. So the price reflects that. If you need a gallon of gas to get to work and you can only get 9/10 of a gallon, not only will you pay whatever you have to get that last tenth, the price you pay for that last tenth applies to the entire market. Inelastic demand, marginal supplier, marginal demand sets the price. 4 million barrels a day goes offline, you're talking $150 to $180 a barrel. Easy, in a very short period of time. Now, that's all else being equal, and the first law of economics is all else is never equal. But that's the scale of what we're looking at here. I can even give you a time when we should look at this very seriously, and that's January 1. Because that's when the sanctions expand from all Russian vessels to any vessel carrying any Russian cargo. Next year is going to be really interesting in many, many, many ways. All right, same map. We're going to look at natural gas now. These are the red lines. This is the one that matters. This is Nord Stream. This isn't a marginal supplier to Germany. It's their primary supply. It's 40% of their total demand. And somebody blew it up a few months ago. Germans are not like Americans. I mean, we talk a good paranoid game when it comes to energy security, but we don't care where we get our energy. We could get some from Canada, some from Mexico, we make a bunch ourselves, we take some from Saudi Arabia. If we don't think anyone is watching all that closely, we'll take some from Venezuela, whatever. We don't care. Germans don't have that option. They've got precision manufacturing, they're in a tough neighborhood with no energy. They prefer large, long-term contracts at fixed prices and fixed volumes with state-owned players that they find more reliable. And the stuff has to be shipped on fixed infrastructure, so there's no variability. So they work with Russia's Gazprom. They bring it in from Nord Stream, 40% of the total. It's gone. Now they have replaced the volumes with 7 different marginal suppliers. We're now in an environment where the Germans are having a very mild winter. Their reserves are completely full. They've already lined up replacements, but because they're all marginal, prices in Germany are now 6 times what they were the day the war started. They're not going down until they get a new mainline supplier, and the nearest non-Russian one is Nigeria. So, what does that mean? Well, it means that we have to think about German manufacturing a lot differently, because they were also not very agnostic or not very interested as to where we get all of our parts. Some from Texas, some from Korea, some from Mexico, whatever. Germans can't function that way. So they use the natural gas that they bring in from the Russian. They use it to power their electricity system, and it's the feedstock for their petrochemical system. And those petrochemicals are not exported. They then feed in to support the entirety of the German manufacturing sector. That first step is broken, so the rest of it is breaking. The Germans have already stopped all industrial processing of natural gas. They're no longer making fertilizer. They're no longer smelting aluminum. They're no longer forging steel. They had already cut their automotive sector by over a third before we had hiccups with demand about a month ago. The whole thing is shutting down because the base thing that it's built on is gone and is not coming back. We have, at most, 24 months before the German industrial model collapses. BASF, their largest chemical concern, is in the process of physically dismantling all of their industrial plant in Germany and shipping it to Louisiana in the hope that they can build enough petrochemical capacity here and ship the product back to Germany to save their country in less than 2 years. But that would require a build out in Louisiana that is faster than what the Germans did during World War II. That's not going to happen.